The gospel of Jesus Christ calls us unconditionally to love our neighbour. Now, that isn't a political program. It doesn't help solve all the problems of our world with its inequalities and its injustices. But it does mean that how you enact your policies, how you do things, must be done with love.
For many, even the majority, I suspect, the privacy, the church and religion are something that ought to be separate from politics. But the Bible teaches us to love our neighbours, to feed the hungry, to pursue social justice. And sometimes the only way to do that is through political means. Joining me in today's show, I'm absolutely thrilled to have Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell. Welcome to People and Politics. The Archbishop Stephen, thank you so much for coming on to my podcast today. I'm very grateful for your time. I was very fascinated by the history of the seat of the Archbishop of York, going right back to 625. That's quite a while. It's really phenomenal bit of history.
Yes, it is. I'm the 98th Archbishop of York, David. And actually, next year, well, the big anniversary is at the moment, the 1400th anniversary, and a particular date of significance for the church in the north is when Paulinus, the first Bishop of York, who was a missionary from Rome, he was a southerner who moved north, like me. He was sent by Gregory the Great, the second wave of the Augustinian mission, and he baptized King Edwin in a church which is now York Minster. So we're gearing up for some big celebrations.
And another thing that I'm very interested by, the Primate of England as opposed to the Primate of all England.
Yes.
I've been at there, and obviously that would all carries a lot of significance and weight.
Yes.
So it's really fascinating.
Yeah, well, David, please don't ask me to explain the difference. I mean, the short answer to a long and complicated history is that I mean, Christianity was in these islands before Augustine came, particularly in the north. But it was the Augustinian mission, which was 597 when Augustine came to Canterbury, then Paulinus 625, 627 to York, that established what you'd call the ordering of the church in England into two provinces, Canterbury in the south, York in the north. And to begin with, those two provinces were equal to one another, which was good Roman politics. That way, the Pope kept both archbishops on an equal leash, and none had precedent over the other. But over the centuries, as Canterbury was the more ancient province, it came to have precedence, which was then kind of hot wired in at the Reformation, and you get these funny titles. So we're both primates. I'm primate of England, but Canterbury's primate of all England. It's a difference of historic precedence. It doesn't really mean that much in terms of day-to-day life. Of course, Canterbury is the more senior, more ancient by 30 years bishopric. But in terms of the life of the Church of England, I'm the primate for the north. My dear colleague Sarah's the primate for the south.
So I was going to start with a simple thing. I was going to ask you what your earliest memories of faith and church were.
Oh, well, thank you, David. You may regret asking me because it's hard to give you a short answer to this. I mean, I wasn't brought up going to church, so I
Mhm.
don't come from a church-going family. My parents were part of that generation who, they met at a church youth club. So they were brought up in the
Mhm.
life of the church. But like many people in the 50s and 60s, they drifted away from the society was changing rapidly. A lot of people drifted from faith. So they didn't reject the Christian faith, they just got out the habit. So I was baptized, and my first visit, I don't remember my baptism, but I was baptized as an infant. But after that, really kind of very little, well, apart from the odd family wedding or thing, there was no church in my life. But I think I always believed in God. Well, no, I don't think. I did always believe in God. And David, I think I believe. I don't think you're born as an atheist. I think you're born as a believer. I think of course I believe that. I think all human beings are made in the image of God. Within the human spirit there is, as it were, the thumbprint of God. So it's hot wired into us, a sense of God. And that was certainly true for me as a child. I can remember believing in God and thinking about God, dreaming about God, but it was completely unformed because there was no church. I didn't, as it happens, I didn't go to a Church of England school like many children do. So, to cut a long story short, the key events which turned that inchoate, nascent belief in God into something formed in the Christian tradition was my sister joining the Girl Guides, a very ordinary thing. She joined the
Wow.
Girl Guide. There was a church parade service on a Sunday. She liked what she found. With some friends, got confirmed, joined the church. There was a friend of my sister's who I rather fancied. The church had a youth group. You weren't allowed to go to the youth group if you didn't go to church in the morning. Very ordinary things drew me into the orbit of the life of the church. But as I say, because I was somebody who had this belief in God, as I say, my experience is, when I meet children, I do a lot of work with children and young people. Usually they have some sense of God, but it's unformed. So I was brought in as a teenager into the life of the church. And for me, I'm one of those people who I can't really separate out belief in God, membership of the church, and vocation to ministry. For me, it all happened at once. I didn't tell anybody, but from, age 14, 15 onwards, I think I had this strong feeling that God was calling me to be a priest. I didn't do anything about it, didn't tell anybody, but it was inside me. So I think I've always been somebody who believes in God, and I learnt about Jesus Christ and I learnt about the church.
And I'm sure I read that when you left school, you went to London Poly to do media studies before you went off to study
Yeah.
for the piece. So, so presumably around that time, you had some sort of calling and what are your memories of that?
Yeah. So I think which is probably typical of any teenager. Although I had this strong conviction that I probably would end up being a priest, I thought it'd be something I'd do when I'm a lot older. Like maybe when you're 30, I don't know, when you're a teenager, 30 feels ancient. So
Oh,
so it was
definitely.
something that was inside me, but I didn't feel any strong calling then to do anything about it. And there were other things that I was, I'm a kind of passionate person. There were other things I was very passionate about. The only things I was ever any good at school were English and art. And I nearly went to art school and I nearly did a degree in English literature. There were several paths open to me. And then this option of doing film and media, which seemed to me at the time to bring together my love of art and my love of language. And so that's what I ended up doing. And indeed, I did work in the film industry for for a year or so after I graduated. And I like to think maybe I might have made my way in that world. I don't know. But what I did find was, in my early 20s after graduating, the call to ministry was much stronger. and it was
Yeah.
like, no, you need to do something about it now. Which is what happened. And in the I look back now and think, goodness, I was just a child, because I was ordained when I was 25,
Oh,
which
that's
therefore meant
very
I started
young.
training when I was 22. I
Yeah.
look back to those few years, and it feels like, as it does when you get older, your youth feels like it was much longer than it was. But I think, goodness, it was just a click of the fingers. And so, yes, age 22, I went off to train for the priesthood, and yes, and was ordained at 25, and that's what I've done ever since. I'm a jobbing vicar. I've never really had a proper job. I've just been doing this all my life.
So presumably you were 25 or 26 when you became priest in charge, and that must, did that
Well, I was
feel
a
like
cu-
a big,
sorry, interrupting,
big
David. You're what's
responsibility?
called a curate to begin
Yeah,
with.
yeah.
Yeah. So I was ordained in Southwark Cathedral in South London in 1984 as a deacon, a priest in 1985, and I served in a parish in Forest Hill in West Lewisham. I loved it, absolutely loved it. And then I became incumbent of a parish well, council estate parish on the edge of Chichester, and was on the staff of the Theological College in Chichester, which again was a wonderful, wonderful job.
Yeah.
They recruited me wanting a young, because I was a young priest. I was only 28, 29 when I went to that post, and they wanted a young priest, leading the parish, but also the theological college was in the parish. So I did a day a week in the college doing some teaching, and then I had students on placement with me, sort of week in, week out, and it was a wonderfully exciting time.
So what age were you when you first got put forward to become Bishop of Reading?
Yes, well, again, I have to remember now. Yes, was
Uh,
I 44 or 45?
right,
So I did basically 20 years in other ministry, parish ministry. I then had a diocesan post and a national job in the Church of England, then cathedral ministry. So I did what a lot of priests whose, it's their lifetime's work. I was moving around the country doing different things. And then, much to my surprise, you don't apply to be a bishop, even less
no,
so in those days. I just got a phone call one afternoon from the Bishop of Oxford, whom I'd never met in my life, saying, my name had been given to him. I don't know how, as somebody who might be the next Bishop of Reading. So it came completely out of the blue,
wow,
and I wasn't particularly thinking about being a bishop. I mean, I was, humbled and honoured to be asked, and obviously I did say yes. You may not want to go down this road, David, but the Bishop of Reading, this would have been, yeah, this was 2004. The Bishop of Reading at the time was a famous, controversial post because
right,
because somebody called Geoffrey John, fabulous priest who went on to be Dean of St Albans, he was appointed as Bishop of Reading, but he was in a same-sex relationship, and in the end, he withdrew, and so the Bishop of Reading became kind of slightly infamous. It was the first signs of the ongoing debates that the Church of England has been
wow,
having about how we welcome LGBTQI people into the church, and Geoffrey John felt he needed to withdraw at the time.
uh,
I, I,
so, so,
I personally didn't think he had to withdraw, but he did. And then
uh,
somebody else had to step into the breach, and it so happened that's when I got the phone call.
it must have been quite shocking at that time because women that I went noughties in 2002, 2004, and things were not as far on for LGBT
No,
people.
no, no, they weren't. I mean, I like
Yeah.
to think, because, without going into too much detail, which I'm sure your listeners won't need or want, um, uh, this was before civil partnerships. And although it is an issue the church continues to wrestle with, clergy are able to enter into civil partnerships, and if they live within the teaching of the Church of England, there's no reason why somebody in a same-sex relationship couldn't be ordained, couldn't be a vicar, and couldn't be a bishop. But in those days, we were still, perhaps not. We were further back in our understanding about human sexuality.
Yeah.
And so I personally felt it was all a bit of a tragedy what happened to Geoffrey John, because he was an exceptional person. But it did mean they needed somebody else to be the Bishop of Reading. And so that
Yeah.
was me. But it did mean I came into a situation where the church was quite conflicted, where people are sort of taken sides, which isn't really what usually happens in the Church of England. We're usually very good at living together with our differences, but that was the first sign that this was a difference that was going to be a very, very hard one for us to live with.
Uh, what what were some of the high points and low points of being parish, parish priest and being, bishop, of Reading and Chelmsford,
Yeah.
so the high points and low points.
So, I mean, there are so many. Let's start with the high points. I mean, there are so many, but I think for probably all Christian ministers, the greatest joys are when you see people come to faith, or where you see faith come alive in people's lives. So when I became incumbent of St. Wilfrid's on the first Sunday, there was literally no children in church whatsoever. My
Wow.
wife was the youngest member of the congregation. I was the second youngest. And it just felt to me, I thought, oh goodness me, this church, where's this church going to be in 10 years' time? And there was a school right opposite the church over the road, not a church school, but a school, a primary school. And I was told, well, they don't accept the church over there. It's a state school. And I thought, right, this is my mission field. I'm going to get into that school. And my prayer and longing was that we would see families come into the life of the church, and we did. So again, it's a long story.
Yeah.
But I started off as a volunteer in the school. I just said to the school, because I knew they were suspicious of the church. So I knowing that schools often need help with people doing reading with kids or another adult on a day out. I just offered myself as a volunteer. I said, look, if you need help, I'll do anything. And so I built trust and relationship with the school. So much so they then invited me to do the odd assembly, and then I started an after school club. And over a period of years, we saw families come to faith and come to church.
Wow.
And on my final Sunday, there were, you know, 30 or 40 children in the church. We had a youth group that met round our house every Sunday night, which had 15, 20 young people in it, three of whom went on to be ordained to become priests themselves. Without doubt, that is the greatest joy of my ministry. That is the greatest high. And then as a bishop, it's when you're doing confirmations and you're seeing people coming to faith and their faith come alive. They are the greatest highs. There are lows.
Yeah, of course.
I think, well, this isn't so much a low because, again, it was such an honor to do it. But I think most priests will remember the funerals they've taken of children.
Hmm.
Thankfully, not that many, but I have taken funerals of children. I've gone to a bereaved family and I've, knocked on the door, and every fiber of your being wants to run away because their child has died, and you've been asked to take the funeral. So I wouldn't call that a low. That was a tough, tough thing to do, but it was
Yeah.
an honor to minister to those families. I think for me, the lows have been about the internal divisions of the church. I mean, in my ministry, I haven't seen decline. I've been blessed. I've seen the church grow.
That's
You know,
interesting. Yeah.
when I was a vicar, the congregation doubled in size, and we had to build an extension on the building. So my
Wow.
experience is of the church growing, and I see the church growing in lots of places. But overall, it's still been over 40 years. There's been decline, and that's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard, and the forces of the culture are against us. well, have been. I think there may be a bit of a turning at the moment.
Yeah,
So that's been hard. But I can honestly say, David, despite, particularly my current role as Archbishop and embroiled in some of the national issues and disputes
yeah,
and the shameful failings of the church, particularly our failings over safeguarding. I mean, that is a low. We have badly let
yeah.
people down. Despite all that, I can say that it's been a joy.
I I noticed that mission and evangelism have been two key things. Right throughout your ministry, and you've written extensively about both. And I wonder what were some of the biggest things that influenced or shaped your sense of mission, and some of the obstacles that you've come up against.
Yeah. So I suppose the biggest influence is I've always felt, see, a lot of Christian ministers were brought up in the church. So the fact that I wasn't brought up in the church, I've always thought that gave me a little bit of an edge. I can still remember what it's like not to be part of it and how
Uh,
weird it is when you first encounter it. And I've always felt that helped to be able to see it from the perspective of the outsider. I've always believed there's an American saying, you can't give what you haven't got, which I think is a good one. Or to put it in more poetic language, we give from the overflow of what we have received. So I've
well,
always felt evangelism flows from spirituality. So the first thing to pay attention to is our life of prayer. So the first thing isn't how am I going to evangelize somebody else? The first thing is how am I letting God evangelize me? How am I receiving the gospel of Jesus Christ as good news for my life every day? How do I recognize that I'm a sinner in need of God's grace? I get things wrong. I muck things up. I don't mean to, but I do. And so do all of us in different ways. So I need the gospel. The Roman Catholic Church have a great, in one of their documents on evangelization, there's a line which says, none of us is ever fully evangelized. Every day we need the gospel to renew our lives. So that I think if
mm,
I've learned anything, it's that I need to be replenished. And if I am replenished, then I will overflow. It'll just sort of happen. And it
yeah.
won't be me, it'll be the overflow of God's love within me. So I don't think so. I'm not about teaching people techniques for conversion or theories or programs, but I am saying be a person of prayer, know your need of God, invite the Holy Spirit into your life to overflow with love for others, and then the church grows, and that's what I've seen.
Answered or touched upon my next question because I was thinking of the math. How do we evangelize, today in 2026? How do we evangelize today?
Yeah, well, first of all, some good news, David. God is busy doing it without us. That's the first thing I notice, and that, of course, that's always been true, but that's definitely happening at the moment. I mean, one thing I notice, and other bishops will tell you the same, at confirmations, is when as you tend to chat with the candidates before the confirmation, hear a little bit of their story. More and more, I'm hearing things like, "I had a dream." And in my dream, I had this sort of, I don't know what to call it, some sort of sense of God, sense of the person of Jesus, and I had to do something about it, so I've come to church. Or I was looking for some meaning in my life, and I went on the internet to search meaning of life, and it's led me to this website and to this podcast, and now I want to explore faith. So something seems to be happening in our culture at the moment where people seem to be more open to God than they were 20 or 30 years ago. It's like the big meta narratives which shaped a lot of the life, particularly of European culture. This is very much a European thing. I mean, faith is alive and kicking and well in most other parts of the world, but in Europe, religion and church has been on the decline, it's like those big meta narratives which shaped European life for several centuries. We've lost confidence that they will deliver the things we thought they would deliver, happiness, peace, prosperity, well-being. And people are, as it were, revisiting those old wells and sort of clearing away all the brambles that have grown around them and opening up the well
Yes.
and saying, oh,
Uh,
goodness me, there is fresh,
yeah.
clean water here that will
Yeah.
refresh my spirit. And it's actually been here the whole time. I just ignored it. In fact, if you're thirsty, you'll drink any old dirty water. And I think a lot of people have been drinking dirty water, forgive me for using that strong language, seeking the things we long for and need in all the wrong places. But I sense a much greater openness to the possibility of God than I've known in all my ministry, particularly amongst younger people. And there's been research to back this up, which you are aware of. It's I don't like all these jargon, but it's termed the quiet revival. There's a revival going on in England, but it's a quiet one with younger people turning to church and to God in ways that wasn't the case 20 years ago. I see that. On the other hand, the church has learned a lot about how to do evangelism. Because in the Church of England, particularly, certainly when I was ordained 40 years ago, there was a sense in which, well, we're the Church of England, we know what's good for you, and you'll come to us. We don't actually have to do anything. We'll just wait for you to come to us. And of course, in those days, to a certain extent, people still did. Well, that's no longer the case. Church going as the cultural thing to do has pretty much died out, everywhere, possibly even in Surrey, I don't know, but certainly it's died out in most places.
Yeah.
So we've had to think, okay, so if people aren't coming to us, how do we go to them? And so we've become much better at building community, serving community, providing spaces and opportunities for people to explore faith. So another bit of, you asked me earlier what I'd learned. Another thing I think I've learned is nowadays, for most people, becoming a Christian is like a journey. Therefore, the work of evangelism is best understood as helping people make the journey. And so that image of accompanying people on a way into faith, I mean, it's very much shaped the thinking of the Roman Catholic Church, shaping the thinking of the Anglican Church. If you look at a phenomena like the Alpha Course, which has been very effective, what is the Alpha Course? Well, it's a journey. You go on a journey to explore the Christian faith because it assumes like I was, age 14, it assumes you don't know anything. But it also assumes that you probably do have a sense of God.
I kind of love the energy of walking with people, walking their path to faith. Their journey to faith is always like discipleship them to faith, and also, I was glad, and you talked about this, and that there seems to be a resurgence in church, particularly among young people, and a lot of young men as well. And I wonder what you thought might have led to that. What's been the catalyst of the turning point?
Yeah, well, of course, David, I don't know. I think one thing has been what I was saying about, the big meta narratives which shaped our lives, perhaps losing confidence in some of those. I think COVID might have had a part to play in this. I still think we're probably too close to COVID to really understand the impact it's had on us. But one of my senses is that pre-COVID, particularly amongst young people, is you had a greater sense that I'm going to live forever. And modern medicine, modern diet, exercise, all the advances, all the human advances have meant, infant mortality is very, very rare and unusual. We live longer. Many people live healthier lives. And so we knew that we hadn't conquered death, but you kind of thought, death, mortality, frailty, that's way off. That's way off in the
Yeah,
distance.
yeah. I don't into whatever that
Yeah.
that way.
COVID suddenly brought it very close.
Yeah, sometimes.
I remember those first days of COVID where you go shopping with your mask on, and then you'd bring back your box of Weetabix or whatever it was, and you'd scrub it down before putting it in the cupboard, because because we were so frightened. We didn't know what was happening. This thing is killing people. We don't understand how it's spreading. We're frightened of being with one another. And I think it was frightening for all of us, but for young people, I think it had a massive impact. And I wonder whether part of that impact is that confrontation with mortality and frailty has meant that as we come out of COVID, so we continually live with that awareness and therefore are more open to considering some of those ultimate questions of, so okay, so I am going to die one day. How do I make sense of that? Is there any meaning to be found in that? Is this life all that there is? So I wonder whether that has been a quite a big factor. As I say, I think we're probably still too near to it to really know, but I do know it's something that people are thinking about and researching about.
Yeah. Do, do you think that another factor could be that the current political geoclimate, particularly over the last few years, has become a lot more unstable and unsure, and do you think that could be another factor in people's
Yeah.
hunt for faith and assurance?
Yeah, I'm sure you're right, David. I'm sure you're right. My only caveat would be, but it's probably always been that. I mean, I think every generation thinks it lives in very unstable times. Now, as you get older, you can make comparisons, but when I was growing up, I was living, it was the time of the Cold War,
Oh,
and
yeah.
you were living with the fear and knowledge that somebody might be dropping a nuclear bomb on you at any point. So it's not as if we had this wonderful period where we were living without fear, and now we are. I think there's always been that instability. But having said that, there are things about our political climate at the moment which do trouble me. We seem to have become much more polarized as a nation and as a world, and that does deeply trouble me because even though there's always been different political parties and movements, I also grew up in a world where we had, I think, what was tends to be referred to as the post-war consensus, which was about people of different political stripes coming together to seek a common good. And actually, the Christian faith had a large part in shaping the thinking then. And it didn't really matter whether you were conservative or Labour. There were certain things that you believed in and you shared, which weren't even just about values. They were actual things that you thought this is what a good society should be. That hasn't gone altogether, but it's broken down much
No,
more. And there's now more extreme voices and polarizing voices. And, the horrors of social media haven't helped that, where we tend to live in echo chambers that reinforce our views and sometimes our prejudices. So all of that, I think, does make it, again, much harder for young people to know, where do I find truth? Where do I find meaning? When there are so many conflicting and competing voices. And again, using my image of finding there's a well which is all overgrown, but once you clear it away, you find something very beautiful. I think that might be, I mean, I think I'm agreeing with you basically, David, that might be a factor that actually we're looking for something. I don't want to use the word certainty, because of course faith isn't certainty, but something which stands the test of time. a set of values, of things to believe in, a way of inhabiting the world, which stands the test of time, not the fleeting voices of the moment.
No. When you mention polarization there, it made me think of particularly today's politics. Is very polarized, both internationally and nationally. And a lot of parties tend to they sort of have a particular group of individuals against other. For example, some parties tell you that migrants are the source of our troubles. Yeah, when other parties try to make it that, for example, people on welfare are the source of all society's ills. And so, how can we use the gospel to bridge these gaps and you know, and to, and to push back on these uh, divisions within
Yeah.
communities?
Yeah, well, once again, David, I don't want to pretend to you I know the answer to these questions, but
Mm,
I think for a long while now I've believed the real problem lies in the human heart. So so rather than so of course I need to attend to these things and challenge others, but first of all I need to challenge myself. What prejudices am I entertaining? What how which bits of my life are unconverted? There's a lovely story which I often quote in sermons, of medieval English knights. So when medieval English knights were baptized in the sea or in a river, it was like immersion baptism. The story goes that as they went down under the water of the baptism, they would hold their right arm out of the water. So it's kind of symbol because it was the hand in which they held their sword.
right.
And it was like, I submit to you, Lord, I'll be baptized, but not this bit. I'm going to keep this bit. I'm
Yeah.
going to keep this bit to myself.
Yeah.
And so that's a question I ask myself. So which bit of me have I, as it were, am I holding out of the baptismal waters and saying, I want control of that bit. I'm not going to relinquish that bit. And I think so. I think I want to say to all. I want to say first to myself, and then to all people. The gospel of Jesus Christ calls us unconditionally to love our neighbour. Now, that isn't a political program. It doesn't help solve all the problems of our world with its inequalities and its injustices. But it does mean that how you enact your policies, how you do things, must be done with love. It must be done honouring the dignity of every human person. Therefore, and I'm not a politician, so I don't have political answers to these things, but some of the rhetoric I hear from politicians of all sides on certain issues, which dehumanize and take away the dignity of people, I think, no, that the gospel of Jesus Christ does not allow us to do that. We are called to love our neighbour, even if we're having to make hard decisions about how people are treated, included, on all the other difficult issues we face. So the gospel always comes to us, I think, as medicine. It's the medicine we need so that we can love each other as Christ loves us.
Yeah, that's medicine. That as you're talking there, I was thinking that I think about the way George MacLeod of the Ireland community. I'm sure he said, that the gospel calls us to love each other, but sometimes you can't do that without being political.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree. Sometimes some people sometimes say politics is about the whole of life. It's how we order our society. The gospel is for the whole of life.
Yeah,
So, what I think the church should avoid being is party political. And we don't align with any one political party or any one political philosophy, but we bring a Christian perspective, which, as I say, is sometimes about how we do our politics, not what the particular policies are, so that we can ensure that people are always treated, with dignity. That's why, look at an issue, like prison reform. I mean, it was Christian people who were in the forefront of prison reform. Not saying people shouldn't go to prison, recognizing that, sadly, things like that are needed for the good ordering of society, but saying, but that doesn't mean people do not have a dignity and therefore have certain rights, and we must be treated as human beings within the prison system. And for me, that follows for every bit of public policy, and is part of the civilizing influence that the Christian faith brings, but also the radical influence.
yeah,
It is not self-evidently the case that human beings love one another. It is
uh,
self-evidently the case that we hate each other, beat each other up, and seek dominion over each other. I mean, that's look at human history. It's a history of greed and avarice, power and dominion. So the Christian faith, is a radical new take on what it is to be human, saying no, actually. You belong to each other. You're sisters and brothers. You must love one another. Now, that's not a political program, but it critiques and challenges every political program.
one of the biggest political difficulties of our time right now is poverty, and particularly child poverty is a spiral out of control, and wonder how the church can help address you,
Yeah.
you know issues like that.
Yeah. So thank you for that question, David. I mean, obviously, I'm the Archbishop of York. I'm serving the north of England. I mean, there's poverty up and down our country, but certainly in some of the large urban conurbations of the north, and particularly where I serve in the Diocese of York, in Middlesbrough and Hull, I have seen shocking poverty, and I think it is a scandal that in a nation as wealthy as
Yeah,
ours, there is, for instance, every day children going to school hungry. That should not
mm,
be the case. So I think the church can, I think, helpfully do several things in this. First of all, of course, amazingly, miraculously, there are. I'm never good at remembering the statistics, David. So you'll have to put a footnote on the podcast if I've got this wrong. But it's something like 12,000 parish churches in this country. And by the way, we're planting new churches and new Christian communities every year. A lot of people talk about church closures. Well, yes, sadly, a few churches do have to close each year, but we're opening far more. We have a presence in literally every community, be it a tiny, tiny village or a big city. So first of all, we're on the ground. We're often in the forefront of providing care and support, with food banks, debt counselling centres,
yeah,
all sorts of things. We're there helping meet the needs of people in poverty. And I'm proud of that. That's what the church should
yeah,
be doing. But there is that, you've probably heard that saying, as it's all very well pulling people who are drowning out of the river. At some point you need to go upstream and see who's pushing them in. So,
yeah,
so it's all very well helping, provide food for hungry children, but sooner or later you have to say, but why are the children
why
hungry?
they're hungry.
Yeah. And so the church also has a part to play in in the life of the nation and in government at every level, to ask difficult questions. And I've done this a lot in the House of Lords, where I, as you know, where I sit as a member. And every time I've spoken on these issues, I think I've always prefaced my comments because I'm not trying to score political points. I'm not suggesting that the government intend it to be this way. These aren't bad people who want there to be poverty. So I always preface it by saying it gives me no joy in saying this, and I'm not pointing the finger at anybody. But we, as the government of this land, need to be aware that in Middlesbrough today, there are children going to school hungry.
Yeah.
And part of that is a result of policies we've made or haven't made over a long period of time. Successive governments of different, we have failed to lift children out of poverty. Our job, I mean, sometimes we can suggest solutions, but our job in that sense is hopefully with proper humility to be the conscience of the nation and to say, we are there on the ground. We know these children by name. These are not statistics for us.
No.
And we need to let you know this is happening. And then sometimes, thirdly, you're campaigning on particular issues. So the church was very much in the forefront of the campaign to get rid of the two-child limit. Now, again, when the two-child limit was brought in, I'm not suggesting that people who brought it in did that hoping that it would increase poverty. Of course they didn't. They thought it was the right thing to do. But I believe they were wrong. It did increase poverty, and therefore the church was at the forefront of the campaign, which eventually succeeded in getting rid of that. So, it's a complex thing. But if the church isn't speaking for the poor, then I think we've lost our conscience.
Yeah. Yeah. It says that you have a hope for the church for the future. As you said, it is growing in numbers, and would you agree that there's a hope for the future?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I really do. But I suppose my hope for the church is really my hope. Well, not so much my hope, my belief in the gospel, my belief in God. God is real. The gospel is wonderful good news for the human heart. It's the possibility of finding a different way of inhabiting this life. It's a way of finding peace, the peace we all long for. This is given us in Jesus Christ. So that's my hope. And the church, sometimes effectively and sometimes not, we live this out and we seek to share it with others. So it's not so much the church I hope for, it's the gospel I hope for. And the church, you can't separate out the church. The church is that community of men and women who know Jesus and are following him and are trying to change the world. But we have failed and we've been humbled by our failings. But I dare to hope that even, with recent safeguarding scandals and failures, as we've honestly faced up to those, as we've said we are sorry, as we seek to learn the lessons, I think we might become a humbler but spiritually stronger church as a result. That's my hope.
I share your hope for the future. I think it's bright for the church, and that. And I would like to thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak with me this afternoon. I have thoroughly enjoyed our discussion and conversation. There's so much that I could go on.
Yeah,
it's
well,
fascinating. But thank you so much.
Likewise, David. It's been a real joy to meet you and chat with you. And let's hope and pray that maybe some people listening this will have their hearts turned and changed, because we all need the good things God gives us in Jesus.